When I was in my teens, there was a smash hit song by Edwin Starr that began with the words, "War, huh? What is it good for? Absolutely nothing." And that is precisely how most people have felt about cholesterol in the last 50 years. But after decades of studies about cholesterol and saturated fat and heart disease, a new song is being sung these days. For a long time, most people in America and throughout much of the world have had a very negative view of cholesterol. They have assumed, due to a massive propaganda campaign begun by a man named Ansel Keys, that cholesterol is bad, and eating any kind of food very high in cholesterol and saturated fat is dietary suicide. But in these last few decades, there have been some lone voices, and then they grew to a significant number of researchers, doctors, and even nutritionists who have been saying, "Hold on a minute, the story of cholesterol needs some major revisions." The issue of cholesterol, saturated fat, and heart disease is especially significant for diabetics who employ a keto or low-carb approach to control their glucose. And I hear from people all the time who say, "I want to do a low-carb or keto diet to control my blood sugar, but I'm afraid if I have too much meat and butter and cream and saturated fat, I'll just get a heart attack, so I won't have gained anything. I just don't know what to do," they tell me. "I'm stuck between a rock, sky-high blood sugar, and a hard place, out-of-control cholesterol. No matter which way I turn, I'm in big trouble." Now, why is it people have been concerned about cholesterol in the first place? The reason is that we've been told that when our cholesterol goes up, the chances of us having a heart attack goes up in perfect correspondence. Slightly elevated cholesterol means a slightly increased risk of a heart attack. Significantly increased cholesterol means a significantly increased indication of a heart attack or a stroke. And if our cholesterol is really, really high, well, we're a walking dead man or a walking dead woman. We just don't have a chance. But the cholesterol narrative has changed dramatically over the years. At the beginning, there was just one number which represented your total cholesterol, so people would want to know, what's my cholesterol? Meaning, what's my total cholesterol? Nobody talked about LDL and HDL in those early days. Cholesterol was bad, bad, bad. So the higher the number, the worse off you were. But after a while, we were told there was a good cholesterol and a bad cholesterol. HDL was the good, LDL was the bad. So if you had high HDL and low LDL, you were in good shape. But if you had low HDL and high LDL, you were not long for this world. And that is what has been commonly accepted even today. But after some time, researchers began to make a distinction between LDL-A particles, the ones considered large and fluffy, and LDL-B particles, the ones that were heavy and small. We were told you could have loads of the beach ball LDL particles and you wouldn't have a problem, but if you had too many of those nasty golf ball type LDL particles, you were in real trouble. And this is a fairly common understanding even among many of the keto experts these days. But still others, after looking at the evidence, were not even sure we had the story straight yet. They began to notice that cholesterol is a highly unreliable means of predicting heart trouble, and about half the people who die of heart attacks have, can you believe it, low cholesterol. And to make the waters muddier still, much research indicates that if you're past the age of 60, high cholesterol is a significant marker that indicates you will live longer than normal and have less of a chance of lethal infections than if you had low cholesterol. It just gets more and more puzzling. Now, I don't consider myself a cholesterol expert by any means, but I have noticed that most of the men and the women doctors and low-carb experts and nutritionists that I respect have very little regard for the theory that saturated fat increases cholesterol, which clogs up arteries, which leads to heart attacks and death. And they nearly all despise the use of statin drugs to lower cholesterol. Let's consider Dr. Richard Bernstein, who's one of my heroes in the field of achieving normal blood sugar. In a video he produced, he took up the issue of cholesterol, and he said cholesterol per se is no longer considered a risk factor for heart disease. He also declared cholesterol is necessary for existence. You have to really strain yourself to find a modern study that blames cholesterol for any of our illnesses. The problem for the cholesterol fearmongers is that we've done a lot of studies and research since Ancel Keys proposed, with virtually no evidence at all, that fat increases cholesterol, which clogs up arteries, which produces heart attacks. And all the studies we've done in recent days suggest that fat in our diets has nothing to do with plaque in our arteries. You could eat sausage and eggs for every meal for a year, and you'd probably have cleaner arteries than you had to start with. Dr. Bernstein says even the U.S. government's dietary guidelines, which criticize cholesterol, told you not to eat eggs and foods containing cholesterol. This has all been withdrawn because we now call it the cholesterol myth. The cholesterol myth. Wow. Right alongside the flat earth and the idea that Julius Caesar was born by cesarean section, the notion that high cholesterol means you're in serious and immediate trouble is considered a myth, not only by Dr. Bernstein, probably the premier medical authority on diabetes, but by a growing swell of doctors and researchers and nutritionists. Sure, there are lots of old-school doctors and medical people who will mouth things they were taught in medical school 30 or 40 years ago. But anybody who does thorough research is going to figure out that most of the bold, confident assertions that the experts have made about cholesterol are either wrong, or else they need a huge asterisk beside them in order to create lengthy footnotes at the bottom of the page and explain the many nuances that relate to cholesterol, saturated fat, clogged arteries, and heart attacks. Bernstein goes on to say, if you're looking at heart attack risk, you would be wiser to look at markers of inflammation. And then he reveals just how little credence he gives to cholesterol by saying, stop looking at cholesterol. I don't measure my own cholesterol. The game plan is always to control the blood sugar because that is the major underlying factor. And by the way, Dr. Bernstein is around 87 years old at this point, and he's still practicing medicine. He's been enjoying meat freely and eating a very low-carb diet for over 50 years. Well, let's consider Dr. Jason Fung. In a video titled, Is the Keto Diet Healthy?, Fung takes up the issue of the relationship between eating saturated fat and heart health. He quotes from an article in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology from August 2020, which announces, most recent meta-analysis of randomized trials and observational studies found no beneficial effects of reducing saturated fat intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality, and instead found protective effects against stroke. Did you get that? Not only have studies failed to find any cardiovascular benefits from cutting the fat in your diet very low, they actually demonstrate that by eating saturated fat freely and abundantly, you reduce the risk of stroke. Now, why would that be? Well, this is only a guess, but I would say that most people who eat lots and lots of fat in their diets freely and joyfully are eating far fewer carbs, and they end up with lower glucose and insulin levels, which are deadly. Dr. Fung goes on to say, when we look at the science, we see that the amount of saturated fat in our blood is more related to the amount of carbohydrate. Now, this seems counterintuitive. We suppose that the fat we eat is going to go right into our bloodstream and create fat in our blood. But studies show over and over that the reverse is true. It's not fat that goes into your mouth that makes fat in your blood, something which everybody agrees is harmful, that is fat in your blood. It's carbohydrates that we shove into our mouths. The chips and the bread and the pasta and the snack cakes and fruit pies and candy bars and breakfast cereals and pretzels and the sodas we drink and the energy drinks and the fruit juice that create fat in our bloodstream. And this is why people who eat high carbs all the time almost always have high triglycerides, and people who eat keto diets or low-carb diets nearly always see a significant reduction in their triglycerides. Fung asserts dietary fat in blood depends little on dietary intake of fat. In fact, it tracks much more closely to the amount of carbohydrates we take in. One of the ironies among the dire warnings from the low-fat, high-carb promoters is that they are constantly harping on the dangers of red meat. Red meat is evil. Red meat will kill you. Red meat will drive up the fat in your body until you get fuller and fuller and fatter, loaded with fat, bursting with fat, a great big bundle of fat walking around, and soon all that fat will get into your cells, into your liver, into your arteries, and your blood will not be able to flow freely. With all that fat, you'll drop dead of a heart attack. But let's think about that. If red meat is so nasty and so evil, let's consider where it comes from. They're usually talking about cow meat, about beef. And how did all those cows get all that saturated fat? By eating hamburgers and steaks? No, cows don't eat meat. All these cows, loaded and stuffed with all that fat, are actually vegans. In fact, they are the vegans of vegans. They are raw vegans. They eat grass or corn, usually corn. They have the ultimate low-fat diet, and yet that fat just accumulates and accumulates in their big bovine bodies. Charlene the cow and Billy the bull have the perfect low-fat, high-carb diet, and they are loaded with saturated fat. In the book Cholesterol Clarity by Jimmy Moore and Dr. Eric Westman, the pages are filled with quotes by doctors and medical people who no longer believe cholesterol is the bad guy it's been made out to be. Dr. Eric Westman writes, "When I was in medical school, one of my professors would say, 'Half of what we're teaching you now will be proven to be wrong. The problem is that we don't know which half it is.'" Westman says it's time to add cholesterol is bad to the half that was proven to be wrong. There's a quote in this book by Dr. Robert Lustig which says there's a lot of brainwashing going on in health. Amen to that. Just as all calories are not the same, all fats are not the same, and all cholesterol particles are not the same. But people don't get it because they are easily swayed. There's a quote in the book by Dr. Dwayne Gravelin who says, over the past decade, we've found that cholesterol causality for heart attacks is nothing but a massive con job. Cholesterol has nothing to do with atherosclerosis, which helps to explain why, in over half of new heart attacks, the cholesterol levels are normal or well below normal. What we see when we open our eyes and look at the tremendous new insights we've gained is that the old idea of high cholesterol is bad, low cholesterol is good, high cholesterol makes you a ticking time bomb, low cholesterol means you'll live to be 100. Well, that idea is naive at best and stupid and entirely counterproductive at worst. I don't think we have all the answers to the whole issue of cholesterol at this point, but what we can see is that those old assumptions about meat clogging arteries, they have little basis in fact. Dr. Jason Fung says in 2001, top researchers from the Harvard Medical School announced, "It is now increasingly recognized that the low-fat campaign has been based on little scientific evidence and may have caused unintended health consequences." Fung speaks of a review done in 2009 which weighed all the studies that were available relating to fat in the diet and concluded, "The total amount of fat you ate had no correlation to your risk of heart disease." Now, there is one indicator which is a far more certain predictor of heart disease, and that is the condition of insulin resistance and one of its several offspring, which is diabetes. In a study in Japan, around 75% of patients who had heart attacks had either insulin resistance, which constantly produce blood sugar spikes after meals, or full-scale diabetes. 75%. Talk about a marker for heart disease. Furthermore, the idea that fat in the diet increases cholesterol is far from a proven fact. I hear from diabetics constantly who tell me their stories. Many of them say that once they went on a keto diet, their overall cholesterol ratios actually improved. There are some that say their cholesterol remained about the same as before switching, and some say that their cholesterol did go up, usually both the HDL and the LDL. However, there is evidence that a keto diet, if it does raise your LDL, will increase the more benign, fluffy LDL particles and not the more suspect, smaller, denser particles. But for the diabetic, the big issues are high glucose and high insulin levels. There's no doubt about the fact that high glucose and high insulin are killers. Let's imagine you've been attacked by a vicious, huge brute of a man. He's beating you mercilessly. You know that if you're not rescued, you'll soon be dead. From a house nearby, a man calls to you, "Come into my house. I'll lock the door and you'll be safe." You look at the man and say to yourself, "I don't know if I can trust you. You look a little suspicious. Those small, beady eyes, that mustache, and those big feet. How in the world could I trust a man with little eyes and big feet?" Well, that's just stupid. You're getting beat to death, and you're worrying about a man who wants to rescue you because he has small eyes and big feet? Take the man's offer. Get into his house as fast as you can. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain, especially your life. And that is what the low-carb diet is doing for you. It's calling you, saying you're getting killed out there with your high-starch, high-carb, high-sugar, high-grain diet. Come on in and get those glucose levels down in a hurry. And once you do get your glucose under control, if you want to do more research or become a low-carb vegan or a low-carb vegetarian, well, so be it. But you cannot sustain living with fasting glucose in the 200s or living month to month with an A1C of 8, 10, 12, or more. You're being destroyed one meal at a time, and you need to take action now. If you've recently been diagnosed with diabetes and you've just discovered this channel, let me recommend that you go to our Uploads page, which will give you access to every diabetic video we've posted since we began. As you work your way through all our videos, I believe you'll find the help you need. A link to our Uploads page is in the description.